Finished a graduate school in Moscow at Patrice Lumumba Institute of the Friendship of Peoples. After that, he worked at his native Dnipropetrovsk University, and then in 1996, after a number of visits and appointments at the University of Alberta, Serhii Plokhii joined the staff of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, where he founded the research program on religion and culture. As part of the Petro-Yatsek Center for Ukrainian Historical Research, he participated in the publication of the English language translation of Mikhail Hrushevsky's History of Ukraine Rus, and it is a grandiose project, and it's probably will take more years to finish it completely. Finally, in 27, he has become the Mikhail Hrushevsky Professor here at Harvard of Ukrainian History, and there was Hrushevsky's at Edmonton to Hrushevsky in Cambridge. So this is a good transition. Since 2013, he has served as the director of the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, where he leads the MAPA project, the Digital Atlas of Ukraine. And this is a very important project that deals with contemporary Ukraine and historical legacies and various other issues. Professor Plokhii is the author of numerous publications, ranging from the history of early modern Ukraine. He's the leading expert on Cossacks and religion, to the historical legacies, identities, and historiographies in Russia and Ukraine. His major work here is on Making Imperial Russia, Mikhail Hrushevsky and the Writing of Ukrainian History, published by University of Toronto Press in 2005. And there are many more books and articles. I will just mention the most recent ones that deal with post-World War II geopolitical reconstruction of Europe, Yalta, The Price of Peace, Viking Adult 2010, and the collapse of the Soviet Union, The Last Empire, The Final Days of the Soviet Union, New York Basic Books 2014, for which he won the 2015 Lionel Gallery Prize for the world's best non-fiction book in English on global issues, and the 2015 Pushkin House Russian Book Prize. Finally, his most recent book is entitled Chernobyl, History of a Tragedy, published in London by Ellen Lane in 2018, and it already won the prestigious Bailey Gifford Prize in non-fiction. And it is the Chernobyl disaster that will be the subject of Serhii Plokhii's talk today, a topic that has received an unexpected attention recently after the HBO TV series. And I urge people who enjoyed the TV series, read Professor Plokhii's book. You will enjoy the book even more. So please join me in welcoming Professor Serhii Plokhii here, class.
Thanks, Serhii, for this wonderful introduction. It's my pleasure to be here, and I welcome certainly our summer students, but also everyone from the community, from Harvard and beyond Harvard who came today. There is a reason for why Serhii's introduction was so long and listed a lot of books and awards. The confusions and screw-ups happen not only at the nuclear power plants, they happen sometimes at the universities. I misunderstood the instructions that I got, and I said that my PowerPoint for today's lecture, assuming that it would be here, but it was a different reason why I was asked to do that. They will be streaming of today's presentation, or maybe it's already happening, probably, yes. So our IT manager at the Institute, Konstantin Bondarenko, will bring the PowerPoint presentation, and probably I will be able to show you also some images. If it doesn't happen, that will be a really very interesting test for me, because probably in the last 10 years or something like that, I never lectured without PowerPoint, so I don't know whether I can do that old-fashioned way, but I'll try my best. So that's a short introduction in terms of the IT, the technology part of our today's meeting. And again, we'll see how it goes. But I'm starting without images. My today's presentation will be based in large part on my book that Serhii just mentioned. It appeared in 2018. And judging from my experience with my presentations in the last few months on that topic, Sooner or later, you get questions about the HBO Sky miniseries, whether they got that part right or that part wrong, or whether that figure was indeed as evil or as heroic as portrayed in the miniseries. So I'm ready for those questions. I will be happy to answer them during Q&A, but I'm not going to talk about miniseries in my presentation. The book that I have written and that was published, it's a book that is organized chronologically. So it starts at the 27th Party Congress in March of 1986. That was the first Party Congress where the Mikhail Gorbachev, at that time the General Secretary of the Communist Party, was elected to his position by the Congress. Before that, he was elected by the plenum of the Central Committee. So really, that's in many ways the beginning of his tenure. And he had very ambitious plans. What happened to that plans we'll discuss later. One of the deputies at the 27th Party Congress was the person whom you know from miniseries. It's Viktor Brukhanov, the director of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. And that's where my story begins. It chronologically goes through the accident, the liquidation of the disaster, the consequences on the social, political, and other levels that Chernobyl had. Already after 2-3 years later, I'm arguing that the role of Chernobyl is really, it was a major role in not just opening the Soviet society for glasnost, but also there was a major contribution to the disintegration of the Soviet Union, that there is indeed a direct line between what happened at Chernobyl on the 26th of April 1986 and then the Ukrainian referendum of December 1st, 1991, which pretty much was the end of the Soviet Union. And I end with the construction of this new shelter above the damaged reactor, something that, again, they were trying to finish for years and years and years. And when I was working on my manuscript, I thought, okay, wonderful, that will be fantastic. The manuscript will be there and the shelter will be over. The work on the shelter would be over. And then when I was sending that already to the publisher, the shelter was still not over. So they only this year it looks like there were the final touches that were put on that. So that's the chronological scope, and that's more or less how I move in my book. For this presentation and for this audience, we are in the university environment, so I will not do the chronological discussion of Chernobyl, but instead I will focus on a number of themes and topics that I consider to be that they were not just important, or they are not just important for our understanding of what happened at Chernobyl, what led to the disaster, what the consequences were, but that those things are really very important today. It's very easy to say that the Chernobyl was the result of the flawed ideology and the flawed political system. Oh, we got the images. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Christian. And the way how I operate that, okay, that's the way to go. Okay. So it's very easy to say that what we have in Chernobyl really belongs to the past, that this is associated with the Soviet Union. We turn the page and we can actually look at Chernobyl just as history. This image is a very interesting one. A few years ago, after the Maidan protests and the Revolution of Dignity in Ukraine, they passed the so-called decommunization laws. And one of those laws prescribed that the monuments to the leaders of the communist regime, the names associated with the communism should be removed from the map of Ukraine. Monuments should be removed from the squares and streets in the Ukrainian cities and towns. And there were only two areas in Ukraine that were not affected by that law. The first area, broadly speaking, was the area that was not under control of Kyiv. So that would be Crimea and parts in eastern Ukraine. So there the laws didn't apply. And then there was another area which was completely under Kyiv's control, but where the laws didn't apply, and that was Chernobyl. And Chernobyl area, and the monument is still there. So this is probably the last, or maybe the last legally or semi-legally standing monument to Lenin in Ukraine, and that's why people are taking selfies, not because they're particularly excited about Lenin or communism, but that's now a really rarity in Ukraine. And exclusion zone Chernobyl and Pripyat are in many ways they work like a time machine. So you go there, especially for those of us who lived through those years and through those days. It's really a reminder of way how things were 30 years ago. So there would be still all sorts of slogans celebrating the Communist Party. You would walk into the abandoned school, and you would see the textbooks. You would see things that they were putting on the walls. So it really works like a time machine. But the point that I'm trying to make with all of that again, it would be wrong to assign Chernobyl just to the past, and to say that we turned the page and that this is all in the past. And the way how I will try to argue that further in this presentation, and then hopefully in the discussion as well, that again I will focus on a number of areas which are essential for understanding of Chernobyl, and they're also there with us today. And one of them is the interrelation between the military program, the creation of a bomb, first of atomic bomb and then hydrogen bomb, so the atoms for war and the atoms for peace. With Chernobyl was atom for peace. And what I'm trying to show in the book is that interrelationship, it was, first of all, really very important. It was essential, but that was also one of the causes of why Chernobyl happened. And let me spend maybe next 5 or 7 minutes elaborating that thesis, and then I will move to another big theme in the book. So what you see here on this screen, this is of course the explosion of the atomic bomb, but this is two wonderful gentlemen on your right. So here on the left, I wonder if anyone can recognize him. I saw somewhere Mark Kramer. Probably Mark would know one of them at least. You don't see. Okay, it's Mr. Alexandrov, the head of the Academy of Sciences, and also the director of the Kurchatov Institute of Atomic Energy. To the right of him is the person whom I'm not asking you whether you recognize him or not. You would not recognize him. He was the most secret person in the Soviet Union, and probably the most powerful minister that the Soviet Union ever had. His name was Yefim and Slavsky into his office and told him that the Americans were moving ahead with the construction of the nuclear power plants and that the Soviet Union needed a reactor. And they who created reactor for the creation of the for the production of the weapon-ready plutonium were charged with this task of creating a new reactor that eventually exploded in Chernobyl. So Mr. Alexandrov, who before that designed reactors for the nuclear submarines, was the academic advisor to the project. And Mr. Slavsky, it was his Ministry of Medium Machine Building that built the reactor, and the first nuclear power plant where those reactors were used, they were called the graphite water reactors, the RBMK. It was built near the city that at that time was called Leningrad. In Sosnovy Bor, there was the first nuclear power plant, which was more or less identical to Chernobyl one. And that plant was run by Mr. Slavsky's ministry. Now, very interesting is relationship between these two people. First of all, I didn't expect that. Both of them come from Ukraine. When they were in Chernobyl, they discovered that during the Revolution and Civil War, they were fighting on different sides. Mr. Alexandrov was a son of a prominent lawyer from Kiev region, so he was fighting on with the whites. And Mr. Slavsky, who was a son of a Cossack from southern Ukraine, was fighting on the side of the Reds in the Budyonny army. But again, they got along quite well, and the reason for that was that Mr. Alexandrov, who was the director of the institute, Kurchatov Institute, by the way, there were 10,000 people working in that institute. He was also the president of the Academy of Sciences. But his ministry was not part of the Academy of Sciences. His ministry was his institute was not part of the Academy of Sciences. His institute was part of the ministry headed by Mr. Slavsky. So all the money was coming from the Ministry of Medium Machine Building. Through Mr. Alexandrov, Slavsky owned the Kurchatov Institute and owned the Academy of Sciences. So that's how interrelated they were. And once they created the reactor, and those of you who watched the mini-series know that there were major problems with the reactors, we'll get there. Then they created that common front protecting themselves and protecting their ministry, both Slavsky's and Alexandrov. And again, Legasov, who is a major character in those mini-series, really falls out of favor with that big establishment. But again, there would be no independent opinion anywhere. So people who created the reactor, they were also overseeing what was going on. They were also building plants. They were also running plants. And important also thing about this interrelation is that the accident, not unlike the one that happened in Chernobyl, took place a few years earlier in November of 1975 at this Leningrad nuclear power plant that was run by Mr. Slavsky's ministry. And the problems with the reactor were already obvious at that point in time, but of course they were kept secret. And when the reactors and the plants were passed to the non-military ministry, to the Ministry of Energy, none of that information actually was shared. It was secret, right? It was a Ministry of Medium Machine Building. It was not divulging even its real name or what it is working on. And that relationship, again, it's not unique for the or was not unique for the Soviet Union in terms of the military uses of atom and peaceful uses of atom. But in the Soviet Union, they really actually never divorced that connection. That certainly was these things were put apart for example, in the United States or in United Kingdom. And the relationship between military and peaceful atom is really very important today as well, but also in a different way. For example, today the area where they plan to build the most reactors, there is, after Chernobyl, after Fukushima, there is less and less appetite in the world for nuclear reactors because it is dangerous. So there are relatively few reactors that are built today in the US, only one in UK. Germany is going completely nuclear free. So the new frontier for the nuclear is the Middle East. They're going to build their 20 plus new reactors. And of course, if anyone who knows anything about Middle East knows, first of all, that it's quite volatile politically. And also that this is not exactly the part of the world that is energy poor, let's put it that way. So quite a few observers actually suggesting that what is happening there is an attempt to acquire nuclear technology, and then through the back door to get to the atomic bomb. So India did that, was the first to do that. All what you read today about Iran in the media. I was coming here, Iran was on NPR. So all of that is related to this idea that first the nation builds the nuclear power plant, acquires expertise, trains its experts, and then through that gets to the atomic bomb. So the reverse way in which that works. Now, military origins and continuing military influence on the nuclear energy industry in the Soviet Union was not the only factor that led to the Chernobyl that is important today. Other factors would deal with the fact that production of the nuclear energy. That's the images that are coming from that Congress. They decided at that time, in March of 1986, to double the number of reactors that would be built in the Soviet Union in the next 5-year plan. There was a planned economy. Why they were doing that? Again, the Soviet Union had all sorts of economic difficulties. There was economic stagnation and so on and so forth. Enters the new energetic leader of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev. He hasn't learned the word perestroika yet, or restructuring, but he knows the word ускорение, or acceleration. That was the slogan of the time. So the idea was that everything was more or less okay and nice with the system as such. They were just the older leadership that couldn't spend more than 3 hours working on a project, so they fixed that. And then there was the question of that how to accelerate the development of economy. And the solution for that was called научно-технический прогресс, the scientific technological progress. And the nuclear energy was the way how to deal with that. So this doubling the number of reactors was the way to revive the dying Soviet economy in 1986. And if you think that the Soviet Union is the only country that relied on nuclear energy for the development, you're not entirely right. That was certainly the story in the United States, that was the story in France, that was the story in South Korea, and so on and so forth. That for the 60s, 70s, 80s, that has been a major, very important component of the economic development. And returning to Chernobyl, when the operators were interviewed after the accident in 1986 and asked about the conditions in which they worked, what their concerns were, and so on and so forth, they told the interviewers that the worst thing that could happen in their imagination was that if they would shut down the reactor without actually good reason for that, they could be not just reprimanded or their bonuses can be taken away, that they could be fired. Because again, that plant was producing electricity for the socialist economy. That's why it was there. And what that meant is, again, if either you look at the Soviet Union with planned economy or you look at the Western economic systems with profit, the story is more or less the same. You're encouraged to cut corners, either to meet your quotas or to make profit. And that relationship is extremely dangerous today. In the last few years, almost every big company that has to do with nuclear filed for bankruptcy. Today in the US, apparently it's actually cheaper to buy a unit of electricity produced by renewables than it is to buy a unit of electricity produced by nuclear. And we are in a situation where the extremely dangerous nuclear industry is really short for money today. And again, that story is not just American. That story is also, again, in Ukraine in the last 2 years, the workers of the nuclear power plants were not going on strikes, but manifesting in front of their plants and so on and so forth. So this industry is not living through its best times in terms of the financial side of their development, and I'm pretty sure that mini-series is not good news for the industry as well. But again, that's something that again was part of Chernobyl and is important today. The way how it was part of Chernobyl is not only that you have these unrealistic goals, because how did Gorbachev and people around him wanted to build twice as many reactors in 5 years than they built in the previous 5 years? By cutting corners. So normally at that time in the Soviet Union, it was taking 7 years to build a reactor. So they were cutting that time to 5 years. And if you don't think, if you think that they didn't cut before, again, think again, because the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, unlike the nuclear power plants in the US and in UK and in the West, were built without the safety confinement. So it wasn't just there. So Chernobyl would not have that kind of an impact if it would happen in the nuclear power plant built according to Western standards. And another thing, again, you of course know about the heroic actions and the heroism of the firefighters. So therefore, they were fighting fire on the roof that was built in violation of all the fire codes and so on and so forth. So there was bitumen on the roof, which of course was thing that it was very easy for it to get fire. So again, the nuclear power as a business, nuclear power as something on which the country depends for the economic development and saves money and tries to meet production quotas. That was very much part of Chernobyl's story and one of the reasons of why Chernobyl happened. I'll return for a moment for this slide using now it's for a different argument, not about the economics, but about the political system. The Soviet Union was pretty much an authoritarian state. And what that means that authoritarian states normally exercise complete control over information. And that's what Soviet Union actually was trying to do. The news about Chernobyl to people like myself who lived at that time in the Soviet Union, in Ukraine, they didn't come from the Soviet TV or Soviet radio. The main source of information were the Western broadcasters. The first to break the news that there was an accident, again, was not the Soviet media or the Soviet officials. It was those were the officials in Sweden who were really concerned that something was going wrong with their own nuclear power plants, and checked and double-checked everything, and only then they realized that, okay, there was a wind coming from a particular direction from the other side of the Baltic, and by looking on the map they figured out that it has to be the Soviet Union. And they started to approach whoever they could in the Soviet Union, and the response was, no, everything is good, nothing happened. The control of the information was not only in the sense of the controlling information about what happened, but before that I mentioned to you this Leningrad accident. Control of information also included control of information within the industry itself, that people didn't actually didn't know a lot about the equipment, the kind of reactors that they were working on. Some journalist, again, I can't remember his name at that point, but it seems to me it was a journalist at that time who, or maybe a little bit later, who said that really the Cold War ended with Chernobyl, or rather he said that the Iron Curtain fell with Chernobyl. Because at the end, all-powerful Soviet Union was not able to control radiation and information about it. The direction of the wind, it brought the radiation to Europe. Northern Europe first, Western Europe later. Some areas in the Alps are as polluted today and contaminated as parts in the 30-kilometer exclusion zone. And the international scandal really broke up. So many believe that the origins of glasnost is partially also in the inability of the Soviet Union really to control the information and about Chernobyl, and response both to the demands from the West, but also growing demands from inside of the Soviet society. Gorbachev cuts out a very I would say controversial figure in my story and in my reading of Chernobyl. He is the person who brings in glasnost and starts reform, and then allegedly refuses to use force. This is certainly true for Eastern Europe. It's absolutely untrue for the Soviet Union. But mostly it's a tragic but heroic figure in the overall narrative of the end of the Cold War and narrative of the end of the Soviet Union. In my story, he is tragic but not heroic figure at all. He is someone who addresses the nation on what happened at Chernobyl only 18 days after that happened. 2/3 of his speech are attacks on the West for their allegedly unjustified claims for the Soviet Union to release more information on what was going on. It took him almost 3 years to visit the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. And judging by the evidence that we have, he was also the one who ordered the parade, May 1st parade in Kyiv, to go on with children marching there and dancing and so on and so forth. A few weeks ago, I came from Ukraine, where I took part in a launch of a quite impressive book that includes declassified materials from the KGB archives. And I worked in those archives on my book, and in that collection, some of the documents that I consulted, they're published, others are not. But I also found in that book certain things that I didn't see and that struck me the most. And one of those was a report of KGB officials from late May, early June, if I'm not mistaken, of 1986, reporting on what was going on with the deactivation of the uniforms that the students used while they were training for the parade and then when they were participating in the parade. So the radiation was so high that those uniforms had to be specially treated. They didn't throw them away, they didn't bury them, they didn't put it under the concrete as it is shown in the documentary, but they just washed them and decontaminated, deactivated. So, and the KGB report says that in one of the regions of Kiev they failed to do that. So very, very interesting information. So that parade, it was again, from what we know today, it was Gorbachev's orders to do that. Why they were doing that? Why they were hiding this information? Well, when it comes to the information about the reactor, that was completed. That was considered to be super secret. There was a close relation between the civil part of the nuclear industry in the Soviet Union and the military part that I just discussed. So everything was classified. The Ukrainian politician Ivan Plokhii, who later became the Speaker of the Parliament, at the time of Chernobyl, he was the head of the Kiev regional administration, and he was saying that for him, who allegedly was the master of the region, he couldn't get on the Chernobyl nuclear power plant without a special permit. So even a person of that level needed special arrangements to get to the plant. So, and let's not forget the Cold War was going on. So the country psychologically was on this war footing, and part of the secrecy comes out of there. When the Chernobyl exploded, the line that Gorbachev kept saying for years and years and years was, well, we didn't have the complete information about what had happened. Well, technically he is right. We still don't have complete information about what had happened. But he had enough information to warn people. He would never do that. And his second in command, Prime Minister at that time, Nikolai Ryzhkov, he actually was more honest in his answers, and his answer gives a hint of what was behind that really not just reluctance, but the KGB was cutting lines, the telephone lines. People like Legasov, for example, who were in the exclusion zone, they couldn't use the telephone to talk to their families and tell where they were, or not to tell, just were not allowed to use telephones at all. We have this high Soviet official, the Deputy Prime Minister Boris Sherbina, who is one of the main characters in the miniseries. I promise not to say a word about miniseries. Doing that again. So he was not allowed to call home as well. So that's the atmosphere of secrecy. But now, why is that? And Ryzhkov said that when he was really annoyed by the questions of the reporter who was asking why, and he said, "What do you expect us to do? To say that reactor exploded, the world is coming to an end, and you are supposed to save yourselves the way how you see fitted." So they were really overwhelmed by the enormity of what happened, and the issue of the panic Panic was that they were afraid of panic more than they were afraid of of radiation to a certain degree. But at the end, what you see is this complete control over information. First of all, helps to lead to the explosion. Second, it certainly exposes to the radiation hundreds of thousands, if not millions more people than would be exposed otherwise, because they were not informed, they were not warned, they were not instructed or advised to take iodine pills, and the list goes on and on and on and on. So this denial of information, it's under the circumstances of what happened, it's at least crime on two levels. First, leading to the to the accident, and then after it. There are, however, some things that the authoritarian regimes are exceptionally good at, and that was the mobilization of the resources. Again, the mini-series capture that very well. Shcherbina is able to just get almost anything within 1 or 2 days, and that was actually true. So they needed, I don't remember now, 5 tons of the particular substance to drop on the reactor, and they would get it all over the Soviet Union and would bring it there. So mobilization of resources, that's what authoritarian regimes are normally good at. One of the main resources that was mobilized were people. So more than 600,000 people were shipped to the most dangerous place on Earth. Today, scholars don't think that if 1/3 of those people were needed there, that would be good. There was too many people exposed. For the periods that they were staying there were too long. At the end, those people were released into the kind of a general population with really very little follow-up on what happened to them, what happened to their health, and that creates all sorts of problems today when it comes to assessment of what actually the impact of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster was on the health or on environment. I'll get to environment a little bit later, but let me talk about a little bit about one more factor that was there at Chernobyl. It's called the safety culture, or rather the lack of safety culture. Chernobyl exploded. The immediate explosion happened for 2 reasons. So there was a background, political, military, cultural, economic, and otherwise, context to all that story that I already talked about. But in terms of immediate reasons, one was problems with the reactor. And what those problems were that when you press a certain button, which was called scram, which basically shut down the reactor, under normal circumstances it works quite well. But if the reactor is destabilized, then when you press this button, instead of actually shutting down the reaction can actually spike up. And the reason for that was there had to be a particular circumstances under which that the so-called positive void effect would work. The reason for that was that it seems to me boron rods with which they controlled the reaction. There were more than 100 of them. They were going into the active zone of the reactor. If the rods are there, the reactor is dead, so no reaction is taking place because they absorb the neutrons. If they remove 1 rod, 2 rods, so the reaction starts picking up. So what they were trying to do when they pressed the button, they were trying to shut down the whole thing with all these rods immediately going down. But at the tips of the rods, there were graphite elements. And graphite elements, when they go down, they actually create a short-term spike in the reaction. So they press the button and it all blows up. So that was one issue. That was the issue at Leningrad power plant in 1975, and then it became in Chernobyl in 1986. Another big issue was that the guys in the control room, they cut every corner possible and broke any rule that was there in the book. They honestly believe that reactors don't explode. They watched this film, The China Syndrome, but deep down it was the understanding that the reactors are exploding only in the capitalist world, that the Soviet technology is too good, these things don't happen. When they were put on trial, they were saying, please tell us just one textbook, one article, one instruction that says that actually something like that can happen. That wasn't part of thinking at that time. So, and what that means when they removed they switched off the reserve pumps. They switched off all the signals that signals that would indicate that the reaction was dangerous, and so on and so forth. So there was a number of levels of defense, and they got rid of all of them to run that test. So what that means is that there was really absence of the safety culture, and a certain bravado in a sense. Okay, we can do that, no matter what. Okay, we have to run that test. We have to run it today. We'll do it today, and we'll do whatever is necessary. And that's again, it's element of this particular culture, particular industry that is closely related also to the way how the industry was formed and shaped. And now I'll get to these two posters that are on the screen. So the first one is of a very popular Soviet movie of the early 60s, which was called 9 Days of 1 Year, with he was the guy who built the Soviet atomic bomb. And Batalov is playing a nuclear scientist who, in order to save his friends or something like that, sacrificed himself and got exposed to the radiation. And there is also a love triangle. There is his friend who is also a nuclear scientist, and there is a woman that they want to marry, and that woman wants to marry not Mr. Batalov. He doesn't realize that he's a George Clooney of the Soviet Union, but his friend. And he really gets upset and does another quite stupid thing and gets even more exposed to the radiation. So the film ends more or less with him being in the hospital. They're getting ready him for operation. It's not clear what will happen, but he is a winner in the movie. She decided to marry him at the end. Mm-hmm. So he's a positive character. That's what you do. Radiation, yes, but if it's for good reason, if it's for the interests of the country, it's for the interests of the party, it's for the interests of the society and your friends, that's a good thing to do. Very different attitude with this American movie, The China Syndrome. Again, it appeared in the 1970s, before the 3 Mile Island accident. You see the radiation is presented in both cases more or less the same. there, and he is an early whistleblower. He works at the nuclear power plant, and he knows that there are some violations of the safety rules. And his major inner struggle is whether he should be a loyal company man and be silent about that, or it's the interests of the society as a whole and community that should prevail. So he struggles the entire movie. Eventually, he decides that he has to tell the truth. He doesn't get to marry Jane Fonda, but he was interviewed by her at the end, at the end of the movie. So again, more or less the same theme, but the main characters, the heroes are different, and the model of behavior that is projected is quite different. And finally, the safety culture, the reasons why that safety culture is not there is not only because the people who worked at Chernobyl watched wrong movies. We are dealing with the industry that is really going through the period of really dramatic expansion. These key managers of the nuclear power plant that were put on trial. So this is Mr. Brukhanov, who was a much nicer man than the one that is portrayed in the miniseries. They got Mr. Dyatlov, the deputy chief engineer, more or less right, but even he is more evil than he was in the real life. And then Mr. Fomin, who is chief engineer, who is completely lost in real life and is forgettable in the miniseries. So out of these three people, who Dyatlov was running the test, only Dyatlov was trained as a nuclear engineer and scientist. Mr. Brukhanov worked at the normal coal power plants. The same is true with Fomin. They just didn't have enough cadres. That was the first generation of nuclear scientists. And of course, Mr. Dyatlov, he worked in the Far East on nuclear submarines with the reactors for nuclear submarines. So this connection between military and nuclear power nuclear power industry is there. So safety culture is another major part of the story, and again, that's something that is important today when the nuclear industry is moving to the new frontier, which I already told you it's not anymore US, it's not anymore Western Europe, it's not anymore even the former Soviet Union. China was in love with nuclear until last maybe 3 or 4 years that they changed their mind. So now it's Middle East. And again, the questions of safety culture, to a degree that they exist or don't exist within the engineer communities and industries, this is a big issue. And I will complete my presentation. I think I'm already running out of time, or maybe completely ran out of time, about the impact of Chernobyl on human beings and also on environment. We really, that's the part of the story that we know the less, where there is most disagreements. The official toll of people who died from Chernobyl is over 40. In the miniseries they give 31, so it seems to me it's 43. So people who either were killed as the result of the explosion, there were 2 people only. So one was just crushed by the falling ceiling. Another was burned by super hot steam and died late in the day in the hospital. And then what goes into that count are people who died within the first few months after the explosion and were diagnosed with the acute radiation syndrome. acute radiation syndrome, that's the disease that was invented, created, conceptualized after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So that's extreme exposure to the radiation, which normally is caused by being close to the epicenter of the nuclear explosion. Chernobyl, by different estimates, the amount of radiation that was released by Chernobyl is between 300 and 500 Hiroshima-type bombs. So that's the amount, and the count is 43 or something like that. Why is that? Well, that radiation was released over a longer period of time, and it was released in a small dosages to a degree. So, and that's a big question. We don't have the conceptualized disease for that. So those people who later would die from cancer and so on and so forth, they would not be diagnosed as having the acute radiation syndrome. It's very difficult to say whether the cancer is caused by your exposure to the radiation, or you would get it otherwise anyway. And today, the number of people who died as a result of Chernobyl varies anywhere between 4,000 and 100,000 people. And all of these are guesstimates. The only not guesstimate is that we have close to 4,000 extra cases of thyroid cancer among children. The good news is that thyroid cancer is something that, again, from what I read, apparently relatively easy to diagnose, and that it's not necessarily leads to death. So that was an immediate impact within the first decade. Other than that, the debate is going on. Today, for those of you who maybe had a chance to go to the exclusion zone, the area is completely, in particular the city of Pripyat, is taken over. The humans are not there. That's how world would look like without us. The wildlife is really flourishing. And there are species that were not there before. In terms of the way how the health of the population, of the animal population, is defined, the whole thing is very healthy. What is happening with the really long-term things and what mutations are taking place among those animals, the research is there. People are working on that. There are no clear conclusions yet. We know that there is an impact, and I'll tell you from my own experience in terms what that impact might look like. On my last trip to the area, it was in January. The tour guide brought us to the area where she said, okay, and this is a red forest. What that means, it's pine trees, but the color of the what do they have? They don't have leaves, needles. Yeah. So the color of needles is brownish, yellowish, reddish. And she said, okay, and indeed it's close to the reactor, and it was affected, and so on and so forth. And I think to myself, it makes no sense. Yes, there was a red forest. That's where the first probably rain went immediately after the explosion, and it was so contaminated that they completely bulldozed it and actually put it buried in the ground. So there is supposed to be no red forest anymore. So I'm telling her that. She says, yes. But the new forest grew on the area where the old was buried, and that's the new red forest. So that's what I saw with my own eyes. So again, the big thing is that we still don't know really the full toll. But what I can tell for sure, and that's we know, is that in the surveys about how people feel themselves, whether they feel themselves healthy or not, Ukrainians are the sickest nation in Europe. So they feel themselves to be the less well-to-do. And again, it's the question not about Ukraine being affected by Chernobyl radiation, because Belarus was actually suffered more than Ukraine. It's the way how people actually, the self-perception of their health is. And this is the impact of Chernobyl on psychological health of the society, which of course, there you would have to count victims at millions and millions and millions. And this is again a big part of the story that is not yet researched. So I'm completely out of time now, and I'll stop here, and we'll be happy to answer your questions.